This is class number 4 of the new God image. And I have one item I want to return to, left over from our last time. That concerns Jung's remarks about anthropomorphisms. And he makes a statement on page 260 of last week's assignment, where he says, all statements about and beyond the ultimate are anthropomorphisms. And if anyone should think that when he says God, he has also predicated God, he is endowing his words with magical power. Like a primitive, he is incapable of distinguishing the verbal image from reality. And then on the next page, on the other side, he says, however interesting or enthralling metaphysical statements may be, I must still criticize them as anthropomorphisms. But here the theologian buttonholes me, asseverating that his anthropomorphism is God, and damning anyone who criticizes any anthropomorphic weaknesses, defects, and contradictions in it as a blasphemer. Now, this is so fundamental to Jung's epistemological premises that I wanted to make some remarks about it. The anthropomorphism derives from two root Greek words, anthropos, meaning man, and morphe, meaning form. So anthropomorphism means in the form, in human form, in the form of mankind. And Jung's point is that all psychic representations are necessarily anthropomorphic, because humans can only function with human forms. As some ancient author once said, if horses had a conception of God, it would be in the form of a horse, because that would be the only way they could conceive. Now, in the Burnett letter that we were talking about last time, Burnett had criticized Jung for blasphemy in answer to Job. And Jung's response was, the very fact that you consider this critique of anthropomorphisms worthy of condemnation proves how strongly you are bound to these psychic products by word magic. Theologians think that whenever they say God, then God is, they are deifying anthropomorphisms, psychic structures, and myths. This is exactly what I do not do. Now, this is so fundamental a point, I thought I'd pursue it a little more specifically. So I'm picking out an example from Answer to Job that might very well be subject to the criticism of blasphemy by theological critics. After Yahweh has revealed himself to Job out of the whirlwind, you'll remember, he boasted about his greatness. He put the whole grand universe on display as a manifestation of his creative power. And then he brought out his brutal creations, Behemoth and Leviathan, to demonstrate his great power. And in regard to that account in the book of Job, Jung makes this observation, and this is a quote from paragraph 605 of answer to Job. Jung says, Yahweh's allocutions have the unthinking yet nonetheless transparent purpose of showing Job the brutal power of the demiurge. God is saying, in effect, this is I, the creator of all the ungovernable, ruthless forces of nature, which are not subject to any ethical laws. I, too, am an amoral force of nature, a purely phenomenal personality that cannot see its own back. Now, that might very well be considered to be blasphemy by Orthodox critics. But it is an accurate description of how Yahweh behaves toward Job in the book of Job if Yahweh is considered as though he were a man. In other words, in terms of anthropomorphic imagery. It is an accurate description of what the book of Job describes. And that is indeed how the book of Job and the whole Old Testament does describe Yahweh, as if he were a man, because there isn't any other way to describe him. We can't speak in any other terms than in those categories and forms of perception and representation that are an innate part of our understanding process, as Kant has demonstrated. So according to Jung's epistemology, that's all we can know. The nature of the anthropomorphic God image that we experience and that the unconscious presents us with, and that our scriptures and mythological formulations, all of which were born out of the psyche, all of those things reveal themselves only through anthropomorphic imagery. No other imagery exists for the human being. That's Jung's point, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to underscore it. So now we turn to tonight's assignment, which involves two letters, the Brooke and Smith letters, November 6, 1959, November 16, 1959, and June 29, 1960. Starting with the Brooke letter, this one derives from a letter that Jung received concerning face-to-face interview that he had, a television interview that was published on BBC, presented in BBC television, the face-to-face interview. And the footnote to the Brooke letter tells us that in the course of the interview, Friedman asked Jung, "Do you believe in God?" And Jung answered after a long pause, "I don't need to believe, I know." And these words gave rise to considerable argument, and Brooks sent Jung a letter asking him to elaborate what he meant by that cryptic statement. The dialogue ran like this in the face-to-face interview. Freeman, what sort of religious upbringing did your father give you? Jung, oh, we were Swiss Reformed. Freeman, and did he make you attend church regularly? Jung, oh, well, that was quite natural. Everybody went to church on Sunday. And did you believe in God? Oh, yes. Do you now believe in God? Now? Pause. Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know. Now I'm going to go through that again, because I brought the tape, so you can hear the living words. I thought that'll give you just a little more impact than just mine. So here are the living words.
What sort of religious upbringing did your father give you?
Oh, we were Swiss Reformed.
And did he make you attend church regularly?
Oh, well, that was quite natural. Everybody went to church on Sunday.
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
Okay, that's that. And it's this matter that the Brooke letter talks about, you see. He tries to explain what lies behind his summary remark. And one of the items he brings up is the fact that all acts of apperception are influenced by pre-existing patterns. On page 521, he says, whatever I perceive from without or within is a representation or image, a psychic entity caused, as I rightly or wrongly assume, by a corresponding real object. And then skipping down a little lower, we know from experience that all acts of apperception are influenced by pre-existent patterns of perceiving objects. For instance, the premise of causality, particularly obvious in pathological cases, being exaggerations or distortions of so-called normal behavior. They are presuppositions pertaining to the whole of humanity. The history of the human mind offers no end of examples. For instance, folklore, fairy tales, religious symbolism, etc. Now, I thought I'd take this reference to causality as an example of a pre-existent archetypal pattern as an illustration, because abstractions never attach themselves to our conscious memory the way concrete examples do. So I want to take this reference to causality and elaborate how it is an example of a pre-existent archetypal pattern built into the psyche. See, that was first demonstrated by Kant, that causality was one of the categories of understanding, that Kant didn't have yet a notion of the reality of the object of psyche. See, causality is the principle whereby an event is understood to be a necessary consequence of a prior event. Thereby producing a sense of orderly, meaningful sequence to a chain of circumstances. Now, a cause may be either mechanical or intentional. In the terms of Aristotle, it would be either an efficient cause or a final cause. If I push that switch over there, these lights will go off. The mechanical cause will be that the circuit is broken by pushing the switch. That's the efficient or mechanical cause of the event. But the intentional cause will be that I'm going home and I don't want to leave lights on. You see. So there are basically two different modes of causality. Now, Jung speaks in this quote that I gave you of causality as a pre-existent pattern in the psyche. And what that means is that the psyche is so constructed that all events it encounters must be conceived as meaningful. Causality has at its root the supposition of meaning. In other words, events are not arbitrary, random, or disconnected. Every occurrence must have a reason to exist. That's according to the pre-existent archetypal pattern of causality. It's built into the psyche. Now let me give you a specific example of how that operates. There's a sickness that occurs in tropical climates that is characterized by the symptoms of cyclic episodes of chills and fever. It's a disease entity that has been observed since the earliest of times. Primitives, along the line of the fact that all human beings have causality built in, they had to seek a cause for that, and the cause they attributed the cause to be possession by an evil spirit. The ancients put in a little more accurate observation, and they noticed that this disease occurred after people visited dank, swampy regions of bad air. So they called it bad air disease. In other words, malaria. Moderns, with the aid of the microscope and the scientific method, have discovered that this disease is caused by a plasmodium, a pathogenic protozoa that's carried by mosquitoes. So currently, that's what we attribute the cause of the disease to. But I'm sure that's not the end of the matter. There's going to be other causes and meanings discovered now that we have the reality of the psyche to take into account, you see. But I give you that sequence to illustrate that whatever stage of psychological development humanity may be in, the innate pre-existent archetypal pattern of causality by necessity manifests itself in the human's attempt to understand his surroundings. And to carry it a step further, Jung mentions the fact that the premise of causality is particularly evident in pathological cases. We see that in delusional psychotic thinking, for example. Let me give you an actual example. A patient in a mental hospital that I was able to observe one day watched some sparrows fluttering around outside the word window. He asked himself, what's causing them to be fluttering around like that? Maybe somebody threw some grain out there, I don't know, but he didn't follow up that possibility. He decided that God was trying to talk to him through the movements of those sparrows. And as he looked at them, he thought he could tell what the message was. The message was that God wanted to tell him that he's the new Messiah. That's all causality operating, you see. Because he looks at a phenomenon and he's not content with the idea that it's just random and meaningless, but he assumes that it has to have a meaning. So a meaning is imposed on it. Now, in ancient Rome, that very procedure was built into the collective operations of the state. Official augurs were required to examine the movement of birds and take the auspices every time some major event. They wouldn't declare war, for instance, without having the augurs take the auspices. Under formal religious circumstances, movement of birds would be observed, and it was determined whether the omens were auspicious or inauspicious, and if they were too ominous, they put off the whole undertaking. Now, of course, we do the same thing when we consult the I Ching, and there again, we're looking for the intentional cause of a particular mood or situation. In other words, we're looking for its meaning, and we consult an oracle to help us out. The basic idea is that the psyche, by the necessity of its very structure, must impute meaning to its experience. And that's why, as Jung teaches us, man cannot live a meaningless life. That if his conscious attitude has become so disconnected from the roots of the objective psyche out of which he's come, then he's not a viable organism anymore, because meaning is a requirement built into our structure. Now, this is all part of the process of explaining, of Jung's trying to explain what lay behind his remark, I don't have to believe, I know. And there's another letter written for the same purpose that I might have included in our assignment, but I didn't, and it's so brief, I wanted to read most of it to you right now. This is a letter written to M. Leonard on December 5th, 1959, only a couple of weeks after the Brooke letter. And this letter concerns the same item, same question as to what he meant by that enigmatic statement. And I'm going to read most of it to you. Dear Sir, Mr. Freeman, in his characteristic manner, fired the question you alluded to at me in a somewhat surprising way, so I was perplexed and had to say the next thing that came into my mind. As soon as the answer had left the edge of my teeth, I knew I had said something controversial, puzzling, or even ambiguous. I was therefore just waiting for letters like yours. Mind you, I didn't say there is a God. I said I don't need to believe in God, I know. Which does not mean I do know a certain God, Zeus, Yahweh, Allah, the Trinitarian God, etc. But rather I do know that I am obviously confronted with a factor unknown in itself, which I call God, which in the consensus of all, always, everywhere, and by everyone, is believed. I remember him, I evoke him whenever I use his name, overcome by anger or by fear, whenever I involuntarily say, "Oh God." That happens when I meet somebody or something stronger than myself. It is an apt name given to all overpowering emotions in my own psychic system, subduing my conscious will and usurping control over myself. This is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path, violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. Now, his remark that whenever we are gripped by anger or fear, we exclaim, "Oh God," was vividly demonstrated to me some months ago when I saw a television account of a subway accident that happened in New York City. The camera recorded people coming out of the car and looking back and seeing what had happened. What they saw was a massive tangled wreckage with some dead and bleeding bodies. And as each person came out and had that shocking view presented to them, again and again they said, "Oh God, oh God," over and over again. It was very impressive to see. And that's what Jung is referring to here, you see. That the psyche itself, at such moments, exclaims spontaneously, "This is a manifestation of God." This is the evidence, the indisputable evidence that we base our empirical understanding of the God image on. These are indisputable things. Humankind does behave this way. Okay, I want to go now to the other letter in our assignment. This is the Smith letter. Robert Smith had raised some questions about Jung's controversy with Martin Buber. Now, I want to describe that controversy a little bit because Buber serves as a good example of a whole general attitude that criticizes Jungian psychology and that's quite widespread in the modern world. In February 1952, the Jewish religious philosopher Martin Buber published an article entitled "Religion and Modern Thinking." It was published in a journal called Mercury in Europe. And this same article was later published in a chapter in Buber's book, Eclipse of God. I don't know if it's still in print or not. It may be. In this piece, Buber discusses three modern thinkers, Sartre, Heidegger, and Jung, all of whom, according to Buber, although reaching somewhat different conclusions, based their work on Nietzsche's announcement that God is dead. And the section concerning Jung criticized Jung for replacing God with the human psyche, which we have to admit he does do, if you put it simply, in its simplest terms. Let me just summarize a little bit of Buber's criticism, because it's such a good example of a widespread attitude, to give you the flavor of it. According to Buber, Jung oversteps with sovereign license the boundaries of psychology. He quotes Jung as saying that religion is a vital link with psychic processes independent of and beyond consciousness in the dark hinterland of the psyche. And according to Buber, thus, Jung is placing psychic processes in place of a transcendent being. Again, he quotes Jung as considering God to be an autonomous psychic content. Again, he quotes him as saying, in effect, that God does not exist apart from man. That God is just a representation in the psyche of man. And he considers this to be a metaphysical statement. And he accuses Jung of saying that, in effect, psychology becomes the only admissible metaphysic. And that although the new psychology protests that it is not a worldview, but a science, nevertheless, it proclaims the new religion, the only one which can still be true, namely the religion of pure psychic immanence. Finally, he refers to a statement that Jung made in two essays, which greatly disturbed Buber. Let me read this statement. Mankind is, in essentials, psychologically still in a state of childhood, a state that cannot be skipped. The vast majority needs authority, guidance, law. This fact cannot be overlooked. The Pauline overcoming of the law falls only to the man who knows how to put his soul in the place of conscience. Very few are capable of this, and these few tread this path only from inner necessity, not to say suffering, for it is sharp as the edge of a razor. Now, Buber's reaction was especially to this statement that the man who knows how to put his soul in the place of conscience. And here Buber says that this brings up the question of the positive function of evil. The implication there is that Jung is neglecting moral values. Now, these are criticisms one encounters all the time from both the philosophically educated and the theologically educated, both. And they're criticisms that are inevitable if one's dealing with a person for whom the reality of the objective psyche still resides in metaphysical containment. This remark of Buber's, this one particular remark is especially relevant, where he says, psychology proclaims the new religion, the only one which can still be true, the religion of pure psychic immanence. This reminds me of a remark that a philosopher once made about Jung's psychology. The philosopher was quite offended by his perception that Jung seemed to subsume the whole history of philosophy under the rubric of it's all being data for his psychological theory. That's true. That's true. That is what he does. You see, Jungian psychology is a Copernican revolution that for the first time allows mankind to see objectively the autonomous psyche and the way it's manifested itself in history. And that's how it's manifested itself. It's manifested itself in myth and religion and philosophy and art and much, much more. And as long as one is in identification with the objective psyche, of course it isn't visible. And one has to find that Archimedean point outside of it before he can see it. In the same way that Copernicus had to really transport himself off the Earth before he could discover the fact that the sun didn't revolve around the Earth, but that the Earth revolved around the sun. Many of you have heard this story before, but it's so good I have to repeat it. And you might not have gotten it the first time anyway. Because it's something that gets new levels of meaning every time you reflect on it. It's utterly simple. I picked this up somewhere in my readings about Eastern Buddhism or Zen or something like that. But it's a wonderfully instructive story. The question is asked, who discovered water? The answer to the question is, I don't know who discovered it, but I know who did not discover it, the fish. All right, one more. On page 573. There's a remark. See, this is the end of his letter where he's trying to explain the fact that Buber doesn't understand him at all. And he's done his best, and he's finally a little irritated. And so he says this: my empirical standpoint is so disappointingly simple that it needs only an average intelligence and a bit of common sense to understand it. But it needs an uncommon amount of prejudice or even ill will to misunderstand it, as it seems to me. Well, is it so disappointingly simple that it needs only an average intelligence or a bit of common sense to understand it? It doesn't need a lot of intelligence, but it does need a level of consciousness that is very rare. See, that's the reason for my fish story. If you've got a bunch of fish listening to a lecture about the nature of water, they're not going to get it. In my experience, I don't believe I've ever run across someone who came on it naturally without a pretty good stint of personal analysis. That does not mean to say there aren't a few, and my memory might be jogged and somebody might come to mind, but currently that must be considered a prerequisite for understanding what Jung's talking about, for achieving an awareness of the psyche as an objective entity. You see, that's because the ego is a fish swimming around in the psyche. And so it cannot perceive it as an object. You have to be separated from a given object before you can perceive it to be an object. It concerns the whole phenomenon of containment. And the ego almost always is contained in the objective psyche in an invisible way. And there are different ways that can take place. There's religious metaphysical containment, for instance, in which a religious creed, or a philosophical creed, or a political creed, or an ideological creed is the containing agent. And in that case, you can recognize the fact of the containment by the fact that the individual is a perfectly reasonable and responsible person who's willing to engage in thoughtful interchange until one touches the containing medium. And then you hit a stone wall. And all reason and decent human interchange ends, because what you're hitting then is an expression of the transpersonal value that the individual lives by, and therefore his psychic existence being contained in that value stands or falls on its validity. So it does not exist as an object, you see. It exists as a containing medium, and that's immediately visible. That's why in general society, the rule is there are two things you never talk about: religion and politics, because you run right into these containments, and you get your whole dinner party will turn into a batch of snarling animals if you venture into religion and politics. Okay.
What you were just talking about reminded me of a kind of emotional reaction that I had last week, and therefore kind of question. The letter we read for last week, Jung starts out very polite, and then he seems to build a kind of emotional intensity. He gets very irritable in that letter. And then he says at the end, please excuse my lengthy letter, but it's very important to me to blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking as I was reading this letter, why is he bothered? Why is he trouble? To have these letters are wonderful, but he seems to be reasoning with people who are essentially can't see the position.
I've wondered the same thing, and I think I know the answer. There's an Eastern figure. He's a figure, I believe, in Chinese Buddhism. Jung speaks of several places. I don't think I have her name right. Maybe some of you can help me out with this name. Huan Zhu or something like that. She's the goddess of kindness. Kuan Yin, the goddess of kindness. And one of her attributes is that her kindness extends so far that she willingly descends into hell to bring. Not only does she descend, she takes on the attributes of those in the lower regions in order to be able to communicate with them. It's a version of the Eastern doctrine of the Bodhisattva, the enlightened one who has achieved his own salvation, but out of compassion for suffering humanity, he can't enjoy his own salvation, but he must return to the lower levels to help along those who haven't achieved it yet. It's a version of that same thought. That's what Jung's doing, you see. He's meeting these people on the only level that they can communicate on. And I've learned a lot by studying these letters. I can tell you that in earlier years, I used to react much more curtly to critical letters that I would receive. But Jung has taught me, his letters have taught me to do the same thing, to be just as considerate as possible, meeting each person exactly where they are, you see. It's very easier for us to say, well, you're a fish. I won't bother to try to communicate anything with you. And I must admit, I do have that temptation sometimes, but it's not a worthy one, because everyone is a struggling individual who's trying to fulfill the search for meaning that is built into the psyche, and it's found by different people in different ways. So that if it can be found by way of a creed, if it can be found by way of a philosophy, if it can be found by way of an intellectual argument, then one must use whatever way is opens the doors. That's the lesson I get from you on that story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you.
Good. Can't see. In the Smith letter, paragraph 2, he uses a phrase which he didn't explain to me that I found intriguing yet. I define myself as a borderline.
What page are you on?
571, third paragraph.
Okay. What's the question?
A borderline concept, the self as a borderline concept. It was intriguing, but it didn't. But puzzled. And the time was complex. I understood that, but
as a borderline.
Yeah, what does he mean by a borderline concept?
Yeah.
That's a phrase he uses a number of times. It's a borderline concept because what it refers to is beyond the power of human conception to grasp. That's why it's borderline. It's a borderline marks off a boundary between a known area and an unknown area. The border between the United States and Mexico, for instance, as long as we're in the United States, we're on our own turf. But if we go to the border, then we step over that. We're in an unknown area with different rules, different laws, and that's what he means when one compares the area of the self from the area of the ego. The ego is a known territory that can be embraced conceptually or representationally, but the self cannot be embraced representationally. Mm-hmm.
One thing you said I still find myself struggling with that we start back with the fish in the water, fish in the water, for example, outside the body of water, which is the earth water. That's clear. Then you said something, I can't say exactly, but you said something about the Archimedean point, which allows one to be the objective psyche. Am I quoting you right?
That's right.
My trouble is I can't understand that for me because, well, I don't think of myself as a fish. I can't think of myself as, for me, the objective psyche is the contained meaning. So where's my Archimedean point? How can I think I'm the union thing. We can observe the images, but we can't observe the objective psyche itself because in essence we're really containing it. Is that right?
Let me talk around it. It may clarify a little bit. Does everybody know what's meant by the Archimedean point? Archimedes discovered the principles of levers. You can if you've got a good long lever, a jack that raises a car is an example, for instance. You can raise weights much heavier than yourself if you've got a long lever. And Archimedes made the observation that he could move the earth itself if he had a long enough lever and a place to stand on. That's the Archimedean point, you see. The place to stand on that's different from the thing he's trying to move or deal with. Now, this matter of the fish in the pond. Supposing one of these fish starts growing lungs and gets out of the water, crawls out of the water and up onto land, and then looks back at where it was and says, oh, well, I'm on land now. Look, that's different stuff. That's fluid stuff. That's something else. I'll call that water. I'll call this earth and I'll call that water. See, the lungfish who's crawled up on the earth has found an Archimedean point from which to view the water as an object. Now, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a level of consciousness that is able to view the objective psyche, the autonomous psyche, as an object. That requires that one have achieved psychologically a standpoint outside of complete containment in the objective psyche, even though we do, in essential respects, do remain contained in it. But just the ability to perceive it as a separate object means a level of separation has occurred which is analogous to the lungfish crawling up onto the dry land. Mm-hmm.
Another just clarification point at the bottom of page 572, the last full paragraph. Hume has a sentence that merely insists on the psychic reality of the God complex or the God image. And in light, particularly of the title of the course, I was curious what the difference was, and what he's referring to is the God complex vis-a-vis the God image.
I merely insist on the psychic reality of the God complex or the God image. They're synonymous. Mm-hmm.
To go back to that question, I remember saying that one was asked, do you believe in God? And then the person said, well, show me where there is no God. And so you're saying to go to a point that I can't conceive of. And you can't conceive of it, because if you could, it wouldn't be there. So,
I'm sorry, would you go through that again? I didn't follow that.
You're saying that to look at the water as objective, and I can't conceive of it. So that you're saying go to a point where you can look at something objectively, the objective sight.
Well, if you can't conceive of that, then it doesn't apply to you. It's not relevant then. That's
yeah.
We all have great individual variations, different ways of putting things, and different images speak to us, and some things and some lines of thought, some images don't speak to us. And my general rule is that if something doesn't speak to me, I forget it. No interest in it. Mm-hmm.
And as you spoke of the Archimedean point, I was thinking how slippery this is, because what we would say is, I'm on land now. More accurately, perhaps, we are in air now, whereas we were in water. And both are sustained by the land. So that point keeps shifting.
I'm hesitating whether to follow up a line of thought that might take us a little too far afield. I think I won't, but I think what you're saying is the symbolism of air in some respects, as compared with water, is more apt than the symbolism of earth. it's a sublimadio operation that's going on, which is absolutely true. But then, if one is going to have some dealings with what one sees objectively, then the earth comes in. What comes to mind is this remarkable dream of Emerson's that I quote in the Coagulatio chapter of the Anatomy of the Psyche. After one of his volumes of essays had been published, he dreamt that he was far off in space, looking at the Earth that was about the size of an apple. He really had his Archimedean point. He saw the whole thing, you see. And then a voice said, "Okay, now eat it." In other words, he had to do more than just see it. He had to incorporate it somehow, and he had to bring it back to earth in some ways. But it's an interesting remark that you make that differentiates these things. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to make a comment back on what Pam was talking about. I've been reading these letters and had the same thinking. Why is he bothering? Why is he bothering? So many of these letters are conflictual. And then the word hit me. And I thought, here's a man who's between 70 and 80 years old in conflict, choosing to carry the conflict. And I guess that is one of the remarks that impresses me. Carries the conflict. So many letters to people that are writing, disagrees with them, and gets involved with them. I think that's something.
Mm-hmm. I do too.
It's related in a certain way.
It is absolutely at the real lesson in relatedness. I really took it that way.
I mean, here, what is it, it's 8?
That's right.
7, 9.
That's, yes. Yeah. Of course, another level of meaning, he did it so that we'd have him to study. In the back.
Along the lines of your water spilling line, it reminded me of the film series that was done by the analysts in Canada that we could do on France, which is a way to read he told the story of going to Europe, completing the project, returning, putting the film in the developer, and the film was needed. And he didn't talk about what he went to redo the project, but he went back and did it. I ended up struggling with that event, actually, the situation of the film. The precariousness of the place of the ego and taking a position that should just be done. The divine method, this project was completed.
I'm not sure that if that happened to me, I'd do it over.
That's what I was thinking.
I'm one of these fellows, at least as I get older. If the Red Sea doesn't part, I'll stay in Egypt. So I was very impressed by that announcement. By when I heard that story. There's another classic story of the same order that impressed me profoundly concerning Thomas Carlyle. He's a 19th century friend of Emerson's, a historian and Scottish essayist. He had written a lengthy work on the French Revolution. He had just one copy in longhand. He lent it to his friend John Stuart Mill to read. Mill's housekeeper saw the pages lying around and thought they were scrap paper and threw them and burnt them. He had to write it all over again. Some things have great difficulty in coming out into the world as though they don't want to be born. It takes an extraordinary obstetric effort to pull them into existence.
Just related to this point, been struck by Pam's question because I happened to go on and read the next letter after the Smith letter. And it's someone had written to Jung to ask him to do another BBC film, but the face-to-face. And in it, he's sort of doing the other point. He's very skeptical, and they do note that he never went on to do it because if the interviewer didn't understand at all what he was getting to, sort of summarize what he was saying, he would be wasting his time to try to get it through on film. That he wanted to meet the person in advance and see if there was a chance to really have his ideas heard, or whether he's just going to be hearing attacks or the opinion of the interviewer. So I'm struck in terms of the discussion that he was aware of the problem of addressing people. It seems that in the letters he found that the effort worthwhile, but in other mediums he was...
Well, letter is a little easier to deal with. You don't have to deal right on the spot with overt stupidity.
Which is exactly what he's writing in the next letter. I'm struck that he's sort of explaining some of where he is, and I think amplifying that he knew the dangers in trying to talk publicly about it.
Mm-hmm.
But the stuff didn't let him off the hook even after you wrote all the letters, because when he had the project man and the symbols to deal with, he didn't want to do it. As I recall, he had a dream that said he needed to do it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it must have been after all the letters he wrote, that must have been an extremely difficult undertaking. He tried one more time to even make it more explicit what he's trying to say, but apparently had to do it and did it. It's remarkable. That's a good advice.
Indeed it is.
Do you know when he wrote that? Was Tina Zagis when he wrote that?
Man in the Symbols? I think it was the last year of his life. Very last year.
I always had to say that Jung was terribly concerned with being understood, because all his life long he had gone through these misunderstandings of people not understanding him. And I think that too, that's why he makes an effort when he gets those letters to really respond to people, try to make them understand what he really means.
All right. I think you're absolutely right, because he tells us in the memories that his knowledge of the psyche in its raw experiential form flooded in on him in those 4 or 5 years from 1914 to 1918. And then, as he puts it, it's all worthless unless it can be put in some form that makes it communicable. It's the stuff of insanity unless you can communicate it, unless it can be integrated in a general human conception that that can relate it meaningfully to everybody. And the energy, the diligence, and the incredible sustained patience with which he carried out that process of communication throughout the rest of his life is it's exemplary. Mm-hmm.
Didn't he say in his autobiography that he felt that God needed the help, and that was indeed the meaning for him?
That what?
That God needed the help.
Yeah.
Indeed, that was the meaning for him.
Yeah, that's right.
In undertaking.
Mm-hmm. That's
So
right.
his experience of the God image within, he felt needed that help. My gosh.
That's right.
They wanted to send him.
Okay, see you next week.